breaking barriers and bridging the gaps between patients and doctors. Welcome to Brainstorming with the Docs and your co-hosts, Dr. Glenn Harrison and Dr. Colby Condos.
Welcome to the first episode of Brainstorming with Dr. Colby Condos and Dr. Glenn Harrison. We are super excited to get this rolling for you guys. Dr. Glenn and myself were colleagues in school and schoolmates, and we got spitballing when we were talking through some patient cases, and we were trying to determine what we can do to bring value and content to you guys to help maybe answer some of the questions that you might have in regards to concerns that you have of your own health. So for our first episode, Dr. Glenn and myself will be talking about the brain-gut connection. So first off, I'll introduce myself a little bit. I'm, again, Dr. Colby Condos. I practice functional neurology and functional medicine, as well as chiropractic care in Grand Rapids, Minnesota. Dr. Glenn is a very gifted and an awesome dude, great gifted healer, awesome person, and he practices functional medicine in Denver, Colorado. So without further ado, let's get this thing started, man. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Dr. Colby. Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. It has been an exciting but kind of crazy week. It had the ups and downs. A lot of really exciting cases that we'll be talking about over the weeks. I know I'll be kind of giving my bits on what I experienced. And same with you, Dr. Colby. What is, maybe just to start off, what is the most exciting case from your standpoint that has walked into your office this week?
Oh man, I had one today that's just a real doozy. Patient came in, she's on about 8 to 10 different prescription medications. She's got chronic fatigue. You know, she found that she was really maybe overutilizing her pharmaceutical interventions that she'd been placed on. She's just really failing to thrive. And I'm really excited to work with her because I think that there's some really big things that we can do to give her energy back and give her vibrancy back to her. So I'm really excited about that. What about yourself?
Well, this week there was some ups and downs. We saw maybe a similar case. There's a lady, she's on, she's quite young. She's in her mid-20s. She's on 5 different medications, a lot of brain fog, a lot of digestive problems. But the bizarre condition that her conventional medical doctors haven't seemed to crack was all of these bizarre skin disorders, rashes, and there's labels and diagnoses for all of them, but the only solutions were pill after pill after pill. And then now she's got this stockpile of medications and there's no hope in sight. And a lot of the medication suppressed her immune system because they were most steroids, and she developed pneumonia. So now she's been bedridden for the last 2 months and has been able to make it to the office, but it's been a struggle. But we're already starting to see some light, and just in a few visits. So there is hope. But kind of like what we're going to talk about today, I believe a lot of her problems started off with the gut. So I guess we can jump right into it now, because I know you have some digestive cases and neurological cases. But this brain-gut connection that we're going to talk about today is our two systems. The gut has been called, as you know, the gut has been called the other brain, and you would agree with that on every sense of the definition. But this brain-gut connection, how closely it's entwined, cannot be ignored. So if there's a problem with the gut, there's always going to be a problem with the brain, and if there's a problem with the brain, it's going to result in a problem with the gut. So what do you see when you see brain-gut problems or disorders from a neurological standpoint?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things that we see is, at least in my practice, is, brain fog and depression and things like that. When people come in and they say, I'm foggy, I have difficulty concentrating, I feel like I'm super unmotivated, or I can't remember where I put my keys. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. One of the largest things I look at when someone walks in and they have these symptoms that maybe correlate to brain fog is I look at inflammation. If the gut is inflamed, your brain will be inflamed. They call it gut on fire, brain on fire, right? Because you have a direct hard link between your gut and your brain called the vagus nerve. It's a long nerve that goes from the bottom of your brainstem all the way to your gut. And if you're having inflammation in your gut, not only is it going to be expressed through that vagus nerve, but it's also going to be expressed through the circulatory system, because your gut, honestly, its main purpose is to absorb nutrients, to break down and absorb nutrients. And if you're not doing it, or if your gut is super inflamed, eventually that inflammation is going to cross into the brain, or it's going to affect the permeability of the brain. And permeability is where things that maybe should get in can't, or they do, but then things that shouldn't get in also get in. So, if you lose that integrity of that blood-brain barrier, then, you can get inflamed, and then you get a lot of, brain fog and symptoms like that. So it's really important to look at gut health and brain health, because they're both really, really hard linked. Do you have any examples of cases that you're treating right now where they walked in and you go 100%, or 99.9%, I have to look at addressing the gut, because it's not the only issue, but it's a huge issue?
Yeah, I think so. When you talked about brain fog, that really hit a piece. I see brain fog. I see brain fog as a result of either a blood sugar imbalance or a gut problem. And more often than not, it's a gut problem. I was working with this lady. She was taking the bar exam, high stressful exam, high stress. I haven't taken it, and preparation for months and months and months. And she fell asleep twice while taking the bar exam, where the proctor had to walk around and woke her up twice. So this is the story she told me. And in addition to that, she was telling me about how significant she was having a harder and harder time to concentrate. But what was really going on during this exam is she didn't have the mental stamina. She couldn't sit through an exam, even though all the stress and cortisol that was pumping through her veins, she couldn't stay awake. But the brain was just a consequence. In her case, the brain was just a consequence due to chronic digestive issues. And so we ran right to the gut right away. And you talked about intestinal permeability. I know a lot of people have heard of, or listening to this, have heard of leaky gut, because that's really what you were suggesting, leaky gut. But this leaky gut is where things that are supposed to be in the gut, like food, stay there, and toxins like stool stay there and should be on its way out of the body. And then when there's holes, so you can think of leaky gut as just holes in your gas tank, these foods and toxins don't exit the body and stay in the body. They start leaching into the bloodstream, and then there's this inflammatory response, which contributes to a lot of this gut inflammation. But this lady that was taking the bar exam, she failed. Of course she failed. She couldn't study. She couldn't even take the test. But once it was corrected, once we did a lot of digestive work, the brain came back online. And fortunately, she wasn't on a whole list of medications yet and didn't go down that avenue, because there would have been other pieces to untangle. But the root problem for her in that case was significant gut problems. So I know you see the neurological piece, because that's what you're working with, neurology all the time. When you see brain fog, and we're still on this, when you see brain fog, where's the first place you run?
I look at, when I think about people who have are suffering from brain fog or any sort of neurological consequence associated with gut permeability, I really look at, if you have inflammation, or if you have, potential pathogens or whatever that are leaching their way through the gut, what are the chances that the blood-brain barrier, and the blood-brain barrier, for those that don't know, is literally a barrier that envelops the brain to basically prevent things that shouldn't be getting through into the brain to get there, to keep them out, to stop them. When you get a overly porous gut, you actually lose the integrity of that blood-brain barrier, and then things start to cross, and then you have pro-inflammatory molecules that can cross through the blood-brain barrier, and they get into the central nervous system. This is when you start to see things that are a consequence of neural inflammation. Things like difficulty concentrating, things like difficulty with cognitive stamina. People who go, I could read a chapter in a book and I can't remember what I read, and I read it 4 times and I still don't remember it. And then or you have the opposite end of the spectrum, or the guys like, I read 1.5 pages, I fall asleep. Well, that's not normal, right? A normal person doesn't forget what they've just read 4 times, and a normal person doesn't get fatigued after 1.5 pages. So it's difficult for them to understand, because most people have been there for so long. But this is something that didn't happen overnight. but you really, really, really have to start addressing those barriers and providing the nutrients and the stimulus to start healing these barriers. So
So
I do look. Oh,
yeah. So just for clarification, when you talked about the brain and the fogginess and the inability to read more than just one page, right? Of course, be able to read multiple pages and actually recall, but not fall asleep. That stamina piece, would you see that in things like driving and repetitive behavior?
yeah,
Red
absolutely.
flag.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I had a guy today actually that suffered a traumatic brain injury, and he has issues with gut permeability now as a consequence of the traumatic brain injury, but he can't drive. His wife, he prior to the brain injury, he drove everywhere. He as example, he says, I drove from Minnesota to Florida in 2 days, and I drove 8 to 10 hours at a time and without stopping. And now he goes, I can't drive the 8 miles to work without feeling completely spent. Um, so it can really dramatically affect your quality of life, and people don't know where to turn. So it's really important that this information gets out there and we start looking at different avenues and causes of some of the symptoms that we see people coming in with.
Yeah, and kind of like the symptom that you said of, and I've seen it as well, where people are a repetitive behavior that suddenly they can't stay awake for, or watching TV and then they fall asleep immediately. Of course, they could be tired, or they just don't have the brain stamina to be able to get through that consistent stimulus. It's not enough stimulus to keep them awake and on, and their brain starts to fade. The I know you probably have seen emotional problems. No, we talk about, leaky gut. If it goes on long enough, it creates leaky brain. That's what you elaborated on. And the filter on the brain being compromised and pathogens coming into the brain causing infections and all of that. But other than the symptoms of, inability to focus for long periods of time or longer periods of time, repetitive repetitive stimulus like driving and falling asleep, or when it never happened before, like these
Right.
are new symptoms. But what about, because I've seen some of these and I'll share my bits, but I wanted to learn about what you've seen. What emotional conditions have you seen as a result of compromised gut function?
Yeah, for sure. Anxiety would be a huge one. There's a lot of research that shows that when you have an inflamed gut and that inflammation crosses the blood-brain barrier, it affects the areas of your brain more strongly that are associated with, it's an area called your limbic system. And your limbic system is the area that's, the stress response, the fight or flight, that primitive caveman type of your brain that's responsible for keeping you alive. It really stimulates that area strongly and makes it more efficient. So when people come in and they have a leaky gut and they have a leaky blood-brain barrier, they can absolutely have anxiety, or someone who has issues and difficulty regulating their emotions. So they go from, normal to when they get overwhelmed, they're crying their eyes out, or, they walk into Target or Walmart and they get super, super stressed out and their heart rate goes up and they start perspiring, and then they start avoiding stressful situations because their anxiety's through the roof. And then they go to the doctor and they're put on prescription medications. While it will help with the symptoms in some cases, it doesn't necessarily treat the root cause of the condition. So anxiety is huge, and I think it's really overlooked in the majority of most of my patients that come in. I know that I talked to you a little bit a couple weeks ago when we were speaking on the phone with a depression case you were talking about, and when we got into the intricacies of the case, it was pretty interesting. Why don't you go ahead and tell everyone what we're talking about here?
Yeah, that was probably the most severe depression case I've ever seen in my life. I was doing a presentation somewhere, and this lady came up out of the crowd, and she was in her 70s, and she told me about her son. Her son had all of these host of the major diagnosis was severe chronic depression, of course the anxiety and all of those other pieces, and he never held a job in his life, this guy. And she wanted to get him out of the hospital because he was so medicated that she didn't know if he was going to make it. Right? He was failing. His body was fading. Really, he was going downhill. So she took him under her wing, meaning she signed off on his care, and she brought him home. He was in his late 40s when he came into the office, and he couldn't sit. He couldn't sit because he was the meds had him so wound up that he was walking in and out of my consult room into the main office, back and forth. I just kept the door open, and he just went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So of course, my conversation, learning about her son, was to her because he couldn't hold a conversation. And he never held a job in his life. So he was one medication after another, after another, after another. That was how they were managing his case. And that the key word being managing. There wasn't any correction. I think it was within just a few weeks, 3 weeks, he was able to sit down and actually engage with me and have a conversation. And then after that, and I'm definitely not a comedian, I think we were in 2 months, and he was laughing and she was crying. She was crying because she never, ever saw him laugh within the last 10 years. So it was a very emotionally heavy piece, but it was remarkable because when I started working with him, it was strictly digestive health because his stomach was destroyed and probably was destroyed for years and years and years. And when we talk about digestive symptoms, I know Dr. Colby, you could elaborate on this, but it doesn't have to be severe diarrhea. It doesn't have to be severe constipation. And constipation meaning having a bowel movement at least once a day. Okay, a form stool. But it doesn't even have to be those severe symptoms, heartburn and all of that, to have a digestive disorder. It can be very, very, very silent symptoms. And you can have problems with that leaky gut barrier. The gut is where the majority of the neurotransmitters, I know you talked about that, are made. So these neurotransmitters are brain chemicals that help the brain stay in balance. So if the gut's not working, you can't make these neurotransmitters. So I guess in a nutshell, we did a lot of work. We focused on the gut, and in a matter of 6 months, he had his first job he had in his life. And he's not out of the woods yet, by no means. He's going to have years of work, but he actually has a fighting shot at it. And he doesn't need the medications that was before because the medications he's taking are much more potent now. His body's cleaned up. So for a very severe chronically depressed individual, there is hope. There's a lot that can be done. I know, Dr. Colby, you see TBIs. So funnel in how a TBI plays in, what a TBI is, and how it plays into digestive health, and how digestive health can play maybe into a TBI.
Right. First off, that's amazing. Like, that case gave me goosebumps. Every time we talk about something like that, it just reaffirms why we do it, because it's just amazing. What an amazing feeling, not only for you, but also for his family. I mean, you really just gave his whole family a new outlook on life that maybe they didn't have before. So that's awesome and good work, man. I love hearing about that stuff. As far as like TBIs, what a TBI is a traumatic brain injury, concussion, whatever you want to call it. So basically, the research shows that when you sustain a brain injury, your gut breaks down within 24 hours of that brain injury. Now, how did they figure this out? They put rats in a box, dropped a concussion grenade in there. Concussion grenade goes off, and then they biopsied their guts, right? Pre and post concussion grenade. And they're like, oh man, the guts opened wide up, So after you have a brain injury like that, your gut opens up, it becomes overly porous. And then all of a sudden, all this stuff that's not supposed to get in, gets in. Well, then what happens after that? Well, then the blood-brain barrier starts to break down as well. So it's important after a brain injury, but then you also can think about it before the brain injury. So what I try to preach to some of my athletes that come in is I'm like, look, how you are before can dictate how you are after, right? So if you have a kid that's coming in and he's eating, fruits, vegetables, good protein, he's well hydrated, all of these things play into the factors that can possibly dictate the severity of the brain injury. If you have that kid versus a kid that comes in and he's drinking 3 Mountain Dews, bag of Cheetos, and ate, a bunch of corn nuts full of MSG prior to coming into your, appointment, and then he gets a brain injury, probably not going to have as positive an outcome if your diet is not as clean before the TBI. So that's an important portion I put not only because of your gut health, but also because of your brain health. You know, what you put in your mouth matters. I heard a quote, I don't even remember where I heard it, but they say you dig your grave with your teeth. And I think that that's probably a pretty accurate statement. So, that's pretty much, you know, as far as the TBI. And then on top of that, when you do have a TBI, you know, if you're eating really foods that can cause inflammation and systemic inflammation, that can just, you know, compound the symptoms of the brain injury. So it's really important to not only look at the permeability of the gut, but also the inflammation portion of it to kind of help treat the gut and the brain injury at once.
Yeah. So kind of in a takeaway from this, because I know you and I could talk about the brain-gut connection and neurological conditions resulting in digestive conditions and digestive conditions resulting in neurological conditions. We could go on with this for weeks, but to kind of summarize what we went through, and I'll get you to add in here, but to summarize, if there is a summary, the brain is directly connected to the gut. It literally is via the vagus nerve. And the gut is directly connected to the brain via the vagus nerve. When there's a neurological condition like TBIs, as Dr. Colby mentioned, or infections or what have you, neuroinflammation, it will create a problem in the gut. And that can be in multiple problems, multiple symptoms. But if there's a gut problem, if the problem is originating in the gut, it's absolutely impossible for the brain to work properly. And then it also drives up the risk of traumatic brain injuries and concussive concussions, I guess. Is that kind of how you would summarize it?
Yeah, I think that when you look at it, they're hardwired. Mm-hmm. You cannot influence one without influencing the other. If you have poor function in your brain, you're going to have poor gut motility, which is like your gut moving all the food and stuff and the fecal matter and all that out. If you have, poor gut health, you're going to have more inflammation, which is, more inflammation on the brain. So it's important that we make that clear, is that they're hardwired. You cannot influence one without influencing the other. The health of one dictates and influences the health of the other. If you want to treat one, you better look at treating the other if you want the best outcomes for your patients.
Yeah. I think that's perfect summary. So for some of our listeners, they might be dealing with these symptoms. Chances are they are, or they're trying to figure out more. If Dr. Colby, if people want to get a hold of you or learn more, where would you send them to learn more about the neuro practice that you have and how you work on your cases?
Sure. So you can go to our website, which is www.northlakeschiropractic.com. We're on Facebook, which is our Facebook page is North Lakes Chiropractic and Functional Neurology. If you're in the Grand Rapids, Minnesota area, you can stop by and we'd be more than happy to give you a consultation.
Maybe even a hunting trip, right?
Yeah, there you go. Something, right? Yeah. I mean, if you have any questions, email us. Our email is northlakeschiro@gmail.com. And yeah, I mean, we'd be happy if we can't help you, or we'll try to put you in contact with somebody who can. So what about yourself, Dr. Harrison?
Same thing. Any of the viewers, if they want to learn more about the world of functional medicine and how we do things, which parallels with what Dr. Colby does, he focuses more on neurology. I focus more on the metabolic piece. Same thing, www.drgharrison.com. Also, you can just Google the Center of Functional Medicine, and we're in Denver, Colorado. And we work with people remotely with what we do. And I know Dr. Colby can do a fair bit of the same remotely as well. So if you're in the area, great. If not, I have patients all over the country, even out of the country. It is possible. So a lot can be done. So I guess that's a wrap. Very excited about this first session. And for next day, I guess we'll be brainstorming on another topic. And again, if there are any questions, feel free to email us, send messages to either one of us, and we can get those topics into our podcast and our video casts. So I guess, is that a wrap, Dr. Colby?
That's a wrap, my man. I'll talk to you next week.
All right. It's been great. We'll see you next time.
Yeah.